Superior pond, superior care. Your backyard retreat beyond compare. Minnesota's finest at your call. Your pond stays perfect all year long.
Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. You know how much we all love our ponds, but sometimes they can be a little bit mysterious.
Yeah.
Like, why is my water level always going down?
Yeah, that's a question we get all the time. And a lot of people assume right away, oh no, I must have a leak.
Exactly. And that can be kind of a panic moment, right? You're imagining all this work and expense to track down and fix a hole in your liner.
Right. But before you go digging up your whole pond, we're going to dive into this great article from Superior Ponds. They really break down how to tell if you're dealing with a real leak or just good old-fashioned evaporation.
Okay, so that's our mission for today, figuring out if it's a leak or if it's evaporation.
Yeah.
And they have this really interesting story in the article to kick things off.
Yeah, they talk about this guy named Dan. He had this super elaborate waterfall, like a volcano almost, just tons of water cascading down.
Oh, wow. So he was convinced he must have a huge leak somewhere.
He was totally freaking out. But it turned out all that dramatic splashing was just accelerating the evaporation process.
Oh, that's kind of funny, actually. So it wasn't a leak at all, just physics doing its thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it highlights why it's so important to understand evaporation, because it can definitely make your water levels go down even if everything is perfectly fine.
Okay, so let's break it down then. What exactly is evaporation happening on like a molecular level?
So basically it all comes down to heat and airflow. Think about those tiny water molecules in your pond.
Okay, I'm picturing them now.
As they warm up from the sun, they start moving faster and faster, almost like they're getting excited.
Okay, I like that analogy. And then what?
Well, some of those molecules get so much energy that they actually break free from the surface of the water.
They just kind of escape?
Exactly. And they transform from a liquid into water vapor, which is a gas, and they float off into the air.
So it's not like the water is disappearing into thin air.
Yeah.
It's actually becoming part of the air.
You got it. And the rate at which this happens, how fast that water turns into vapor, that's affected by a whole bunch of things.
Like what?
Well, obviously, temperature is a big one. The hotter it is, the faster the evaporation happens.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like a puddle on a hot day dries up way quicker than on a cool day.
Exactly. It's like if you heat up a pot of water on the stove, it boils away much faster.
Okay, so sun exposure equals more evaporation.
Hmm.
What about other weather factors, like humidity? Does that play a role?
Oh, huge. Humidity is basically a measure of how much moisture is already in the air. So if the air is really dry, it's like a sponge ready to soak up more water.
So in a dry climate, you're going to get more evaporation from your pond.
Exactly. The air is just thirstier. You'll notice this in the winter, too. Even though it's cold, water can still evaporate, especially when it's dry and windy.
I never really thought about that.
Yeah, it's called sublimation, when ice turns directly into vapor without melting first.
Oh, wow. So even in the winter, I could be losing water to evaporation.
Yep. And speaking of wind, that's another big factor.
Oh, yeah. I bet wind just whisks that water vapor away.
Exactly. It speeds up the whole process because it's constantly removing that humid air right above the pond's surface and replacing it with drier air that can absorb even more moisture.
So wind is kind of like a evaporation accelerator.
Pretty much. So if your pond is in a really exposed spot, you're going to get more evaporation.
Makes sense? Okay, so we got temperature, humidity, and wind. What about the pond itself? Does the size and shape matter?
Definitely. Think about it this way. A shallow dish of water will evaporate faster than a tall, narrow glass of water, right?
Yeah, because there's more surface area exposed to the air.
Exactly. Same thing with ponds. A shallow, wide pond will lose water more quickly than a deeper one with a smaller surface area.
Okay, so that's something to keep in mind when you're designing a pond.
For sure. And then there are the water features.
Oh, yeah, all those beautiful waterfalls and fountains. Do those increase evaporation?
They totally do. All that splashing and spraying creates more surface area for the water to evaporate from.
Plus, the water's moving around more, so it's getting more exposed to the air.
Exactly. It's like the difference between a still pool of water and a choppy lake. The lake's going to evaporate faster.
So there's a bit of a trade-off there. The
Yeah.
beauty of those features versus the increased water loss.
Yeah, you got to weigh the pros and cons. What about aerators, though? Those are important for fish health. But do those bubbles add to the evaporation? Good question. They can contribute a little bit because those bubbles are creating more surface area, but it's usually not a significant amount.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of factors here. Temperature, humidity, wind pond size, and shape, water, features, aerators.
Mm-hmm.
So with all that in mind, how much evaporation is considered normal?
Well, that's a tricky question. There's no magic number that applies to every pond because it's so dependent on your specific location and climate.
So it's more about figuring out what's normal for your own pond.
Exactly.
Hmm.
You got to play detective a little bit.
Okay, well, I was looking into this, and Iowa State University Extension says, like, under normal summer conditions, you could be losing a quarter to a half inch of water every day just from evaporation.
Yeah, and that might not sound like a lot, but think about it in terms of gallons.
Okay, how much are we talking?
Well, like for a typical 10 by 15-foot pond, that half-inch loss translates to like 10 to 15 gallons a day.
Whoa, that's actually way more than I would have thought.
Right. It adds up. And remember, that's just an average, so if you have a really hot day or a super windy day, you could easily lose even more.
Okay, so it's definitely something to be aware of, but how do we know if it's just evaporation or if we actually have a leak?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, right?
Hmm.
Well, one of the first things to check is for any wet spots around your pond.
Like around the edges or?
Yeah, exactly. Like if you see consistently damp ground, especially near the liner or any of your equipment, that could be a sign that water's leaking out.
Okay, so it's almost like we're looking for water footprints.
Pretty much. And another good test is to turn off all your pumps, waterfalls, streams, anything that's circulating water.
Okay, and then what do we do?
Just monitor the water level for a day or two. If it stabilizes with everything off, then you probably have a leak somewhere in your plumbing system.
So we're kind of isolating the suspects here, ruling out evaporation as the culprit.
Exactly. But one important note here. Don't turn off your aerators. Those are crucial for keeping your fish healthy.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that. We don't want to suffocate the fish while we're trying to solve a leak.
Right. Oxygen is key, so keep those aerators bubbling even if you turn off everything else.
Got it. So what if we've checked for wet spots and we've turned off the water features and we're still not sure if it's a leak or evaporation?
Well, Superior Ponds has this really helpful resource called their Pond Leak Discovery Guide.
Oh, that sounds useful. What's in the guide?
It basically walks you through all the steps to pinpoint and address leaks. It's super comprehensive.
Okay, so if anyone out there is suspecting a leak, that guide is definitely worth checking out.
For sure. But even if you don't have a leak, dealing with evaporation can still be a pain, especially when you're constantly having to top off your pond.
Right, it feels like you're just pouring water down the drain.
Yeah, I get it. But the good news is there are things you can do to minimize those losses.
Okay, tell me more. I need all the tips and tricks I can get.
Well, one of the most effective strategies is to increase shade over your pond.
Oh, that makes sense. Less direct sunlight means less heat, means less evaporation.
Exactly. And there are a bunch of ways to do this. You could plant some floating plants like water lilies or hyacinths.
Oh yeah, those are beautiful. And they provide cover too?
Right, they act like little umbrellas. And you could also consider adding a shade sail or a pergola.
Oh, I love those. Those look so elegant.
They do, and they're practical too, especially if you live in a really sunny area. You could even plant some trees or shrubs around your pond for natural shade.
That's a great idea.
Mm.
But we got to be careful about leaves falling in the pond, right?
Yeah, definitely. You don't want to create a new problem while you're trying to solve another one. So choose your plants wisely.
Okay, good point. So shade is key. What else can we do?
Well, remember how we talked about water features increasing evaporation?
Yeah, all that splashing and spraying.
Right. So if you have a waterfall, you can try lowering the height to reduce the amount of splashing.
Okay, so it's not just about having a waterfall. It's about designing it in a way that minimizes water loss.
Exactly. And you can also use something called splash rocks.
What are those?
They're basically rocks that are strategically placed to redirect the falling water back into the pond. So instead of spraying out everywhere, it kind of flows gently back in.
Oh, that's smart.
Yeah.
So we're kind of herding those water molecules back where they belong.
Yep. Keeping them in the pond where they can do their job.
Okay, I like that. So we've got shade, we've got water feature optimization.
Yeah.
What about high-tech solutions? Are there any gadgets that can help us out here?
You bet. There's something called a pond autofill system.
Oh, I've heard about those.
Yeah.
What exactly do they do?
Basically, it's a device that automatically adds water to your pond as needed, so it keeps the level consistent even with evaporation.
So I don't have to constantly be checking it and topping it off myself.
Exactly. It takes all the desk work out. And it's actually recommended by the University of Florida IFAS Extension.
Oh, wow. So they're legit?
Yeah, they say it's a really practical solution for maintaining a stable pond environment.
Especially in areas with high evaporation rates, I bet.
Right. And I know Superior Ponds uses these systems a lot for their maintenance clients, so they're definitely a popular choice.
Okay, so we've got the expert seal of approval there. That's good to know.
Yeah.
But before we move on, I want to talk about the pond itself. Does the actual design of the pond play a role in how much water evaporates?
Huge role. Remember how we were talking about shallow, wide ponds losing water faster?
Yeah, because of the surface area.
Right. So if you're designing a pond from scratch, you definitely want to go deeper rather than wider.
Okay, so depth over width.
Yeah.
And what about those stepped ponds? I've seen those in magazines. They're so cool.
They are cool, and they're actually really good for minimizing evaporation.
How so?
Well, the different levels create what are called geothermal layers, and those layers help to stabilize the temperature of the pond.
So it's less affected by the outside temperature swings.
Exactly, and that means less evaporation. It's
Yeah.
like the pond has its own built-in climate control.
That's amazing. It's like you're building a little ecosystem.
And that's what it's all about, creating a thriving, balanced environment.
So to recap, we've got shade, we've got optimized water features, we've got autofill systems, and we've got smart pond designs. It's like we have a whole toolbox for fighting evaporation.
Exactly. And the key is to find the right combination of tools for your specific pond and your climate.
And remember, even if you're doing everything right, you're still going to get some evaporation. It's a natural process.
Totally normal.
Yeah.
So don't panic if you see your water level go down a bit. Just keep an eye on things and make adjustments as needed.
Okay, great advice. So what strategies have you guys tried for minimizing evaporation in your ponds? What's worked best for you? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear from you.
You know, it's amazing how much we've learned just from digging into this one article about evaporation.
Yeah, it really shows you how much there is to know about keeping a pond healthy. Right, it's not just about filling a hole with water and throwing some fish in there. There's a whole science to it.
Totally. And I think this article did a great job of breaking it down in a way that's easy to understand.
Absolutely. And I love how they focused on solutions too. It's not just about identifying the problem. It's about finding ways to manage it.
Exactly. Like we talked about, there are so many things you can do to minimize evaporation, from simple things like adding shade to more high-tech options like those autofill systems.
And even just understanding how the design of your pond can affect evaporation. That's huge.
Yeah. If you're starting from scratch, you can really make choices that will save you water and headaches down the road.
Right. So it's all about being proactive and informed.
And I think that's a really empowering message. You don't have to just sit back and watch your pond evaporate. You can take control.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one key takeaway you want listeners to remember?
I think it's important to remember that evaporation is a natural process. It's going to happen no matter what.
Right. We can't completely stop it.
But we can understand it. We can understand the factors that influence it, and we can take steps to manage it.
Exactly. It's about working with nature, not against it.
And remember, if you ever feel overwhelmed or you're not sure what to do, there are resources out there. Companies like Superior Ponds are experts in this stuff. They can help you troubleshoot problems and come up with solutions.
That's a great point. Don't be afraid to reach out for help.
And also, don't be afraid to experiment and learn from your own pond. Every pond is different, and what works for one might not work for another.
So keep those observations going.
Absolutely. And keep sharing your experiences with the pond community. We can all learn from each other.
Well said. So on that note, I think it's time to wrap things up.
Yeah, I think we've covered a lot of ground today.
We definitely went deep on this one. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive, everyone.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
Until next time, happy ponding.
Happy ponding.
Superior pond, superior care, your backyard retreat beyond compare. Minnesota's finest at your